Every year, Project Censored produces a top 25 list of the most underreported stories of the year. Walter Cronkite said of Project Censored, "It's one of the organizations that we should listen to." Their director is Mickey Huff, and he joins us now via Skype from San Francisco. He's a professor of social science and history at Diablo Valley College. He's back on the program to give us the rest of the list of the most underreported news stories of 2013 and how those stories affect you and your family. Welcome back, Mickey.
Thank you again. Thanks for having me back.
Mickey, yesterday we left off at number 10 on the list of most underreported stories of 2013. So today we get into the top 10. Moving on to number 10, a culture of cruelty among Mexico-U.S. border. Details behind that story.
Well, there are a lot of stories that go on around the border with Mexico. You hear far fewer stories about Canada. But as far as the U.S.-Mexican border, this story particularly is looking, it looks at how people trying to cross the border are treated. It really looks at some of the violence and deaths that occur from people trying to cross the border. And it also, I have to say that the story, the couple of stories, one from Alternet, another is on something called nomoredeaths.org, which is an activist group that's dealing with these problems with immigration and how people are treated in terms of human rights. And that's one of the perspectives that's often missing from U.S. discussion of immigration issues or border issues. The corporate news media rarely talks about how people are treated.
So why does it? Why didn't this story make it into the national scale? Why is it buried on page 9, if you will?
Well, one of the reasons is that it's a story about human beings. It really humanizes immigrants, and instead of talking about quote unquote the immigration problem in the United States. And again, a lot of that is code for, well, there are certain types of people that people don't want to come into the United States. And there are certain reasons for that. But these stories are about, literally one of the stories is called A Culture of Cruelty. And it talks about how immigrants are treated like animals, left to die. Again, these are things that, are part of our immigration history. Yet they're often the stories we don't hear. And if you go back in U.S. history, you hear the stories of Emma Lazarus, who has the poem on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, right? That's the great, melting pot idea of anyone can come to the United States. Ironically, at the same time the United States was receiving the Statue of Liberty as a gift from France, they were also passing a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, excluding people from coming into the country who come from certain places. And again, there's an implicit sense of racism underneath a lot of the discussion of immigration in the United States, and that never seems to come up.
So does this story humanize immigration to a point where it becomes less attractive for those with a political agenda?
I would say so. If the agenda is controlling the borders, then that happens, however it needs to happen, right? When you're dealing with immigration problem and you're dealing with statistics, it has a different ring to it in the public than if you talk about, humanizing this. And, a lot of the people that are coming and trying to come into the United States were negatively affected by the Clinton era administration's NAFTA policies. So once again, these stories in the present, they aren't without context. And we try to urge people to understand more of the history behind some of these stories, as well as the human effort. So some of the things that we believe at Project Censored that are censored about these stories are these types of perspectives. And we think people have a right to hear these if they live in a society that purports to have a free press.
Mickey, coming in at number 9, Icelanders vote to include commons in their constitution. What is commons? And give us the details behind this story.
Well, that's great that you asked that question, because when I teach, history and I teach, social science courses and so on, one of the concepts that I bring into the discussion is a concept of the commons, right? One of Project Censored's offshoot projects is called The Fair Share of the Common Heritage, and it looks at a history of the concept of the commons and the public sphere and what belongs to all of us as human beings. on the planet, like that we have the right to life, we have the right to air, we have the right to water. We have these basic rights, and what the commons is the commons is the area of things that are required for human survival, right? And we would add to that list that it isn't just things like food and water and these these basic needs, but it's also education, the right to human knowledge, right? And what we've seen over the centuries is what's referred to as the enclosure movement, which privatizes many components of the commons for profit, and actually then ends up limiting the exposure or the access people have to many things that they actually need to operate on a level playing field. And Iceland clearly has understood this. If you go to the website on the Commons, there's another one called Commons Magazine. This was also reported in Open Democracy. I mean, so there are groups that really look out for these commons issues. Iceland is putting this in their constitution. Ecuador put into their constitution nature. There are certain rights that other living beings, species, etc., have that really need to be recognized and really need to be understood historically. And if we're to grapple with some of the problems we face in the future, whether they be with the climate or with the ramifications of privatization and the enclosure movement, which actually acts to limit the spread of liberty and cause a lot of other problems.
So is this similar to the inherent rights that we have in our Constitution now being codified by the Icelanders?
Yes, really it is, but it goes beyond that. It really goes beyond the idea of private property. And it talks more about what is public. What does everyone have a right to, whether they own property or not? Whether they can afford to buy water shouldn't mean that they aren't allowed access to water, because it's something that we need for survival. Years ago, when Bechtel in San Francisco went into Bolivia, they tried to privatize the water system there. And the people in Bolivia called a general strike. 80% of the country completely went berserk over it, and they kicked Bechtel out. They were subsequently fined through the WTO, by the way, because they broke these treaties. But when it comes down to the end of it here, these people were getting cut off from their own water supplies for profit. And this kind of a story in Iceland shows that there are people in the world and places in the world where they take the commons more seriously than they have in some cultures where things have been utterly commercialized and monetized.
Now you mentioned the WTO, which brings me to number 8. Bank interests inflate global prices by 35 to 40%. What's the story behind that?
Well, Ellen Brown, who's done a lot of great work with the Public Banking Institute, has written about these issues for a long time and talks about solutions to our economic problems.
Ellen Brown was just a guest on our program recently.
Oh, Ellen Brown does fantastic work. Web of Debt, highly recommended to check out. This story that she was talking about is in our 2014 book, and it looks at how, because we are controlled by these transnational banks, these private for-profit banks, basically what she's arguing is that 35 to 40% of money that we use and spend ends up going to banks. It ends up being a significant part of the reason why prices have been going up on everything from food to real estate, and banks are profiting through interest. And if the public were more attuned to this and understood the problems of major banks and corporate banks and these investment banks, they would tune in to the alternatives of public banking. We also work with another project at Project Censored called What the World Could Be with Ken Walden, who has a series of really great short interviews that talk about these very problems and what everyday people can actually do about them. There's another project called Move Your Money. There's a lot of different ways people can get involved to solve these problems once they understand where they're coming from. And that's why we think people should be really paying attention to Ellen Brown, Dean Baker, Michael Hudson, for example, and of course the Public Banking Institute.
All right, coming in at number 7, Merchants of Death and Nuclear Weapons. What does that headline mean?
Well, this story, this is a really big story in terms of the ramifications of it. In reality, if we had a nuclear attack of any kind, if we had the detonation of nuclear weapons on the planet, we would be looking at what's called a nuclear winter. And that easily can wipe out 1 billion people. What the story really is reminding us is that, even though in the 80s there were movements to curtail nukes and to curtail nuclear proliferation, and of course we've heard that in the Iran story, right? We don't want more countries with nuclear weapons. But the problem is there's already too many nuclear weapons. And this story really, I think, piggybacks on some of the other stories we've done over the last couple of years on Fukushima, on the fairy tale of clean and safe nuclear energy. There really isn't a way to provide clean and safe nuclear energy. Just take a look at what's going on. Take a look at when we've had a few very serious problems with nuclear energy. It threatens many of us on the planet. And this story is just another one that reminds us that we've already got stockpiles of nuclear weapons sitting all over the place. People don't really know what to do with them or aren't always decommissioning them. It costs a whole lot of money that could be spent on something else. There's always that to factor into the equation. And the United States is already spending 57% of our discretionary budget on the military next year, according to Obama's budget. And that's going for more new nuclear technologies. I mean, just realistically, as a common person in the United States, what on earth are we going to do with these things? And the real problem, again, lies with the crux of Project Censored. Many people are just unaware. Many people are unaware that these things are going on, that there's a new age of nuclear weapons. And just as we talk about trying to not spread nuclear weapons in the Middle East, say in Iran, we've already got nukes in Israel, India and Pakistan have them, Western Europe has them, Russia has them. There's already so many nuclear weapons on the planet, we could wipe all of ourselves out and our future. So just because the Cold War ended didn't necessarily mean the nuclear threat subsided. And perhaps maybe the nuclear threat is maybe more significant now than at any time. But most people don't see it that way because it's never presented to them as being an ongoing potential catastrophe waiting to happen.
All right, number 6, it feels like it's related to number 8. Number 6 is billionaires' rising wealth intensifies poverty and inequality. Who was the first to report on that story, and what are the details?
Well, George Monbiot wrote about that in Britain. What we're talking about here is, again, we can always boil it down to a cliche. The rich seem to get richer, the poor seem to get poorer. All the indicators suggest that. The data clearly suggests that this is a problem. What we saw in the last couple of years is the world's 100 richest people controlled $240 billion. And this collectively, they were worth almost $2 trillion, basically. This is a riveting amount of wealth. And when we take a look at how much wealth is concentrated in so few, and when we take a look at, say, how the Federal Reserve which is their 100th anniversary here, right, this year, when we take a look at how many trillions, trillions of dollars, $30 trillion flooded from the Federal Reserve into the global economy for banking and to bail out banks, it will only cost $2 trillion to really eliminate something like global poverty. You could eliminate student loan debt. It's $1 trillion. Student loan debt in the United States has eclipsed credit card debt. Where are the jubilees for hardworking people? Where are the jubilees? We see jubilees for banks. We see more bailouts for banks. We see nobody from Wall Street going to prison. Who we see going to prison are whistleblowers. Who we see going to prison are poor people and often poor people of color. Again, it's not that we have a shortage of wealth. We have a wealth distribution problem, and a lot of it resides in not just the 1%, but the 0.0001%. And Peter Phillips, our former director of Project Censored, has written 2 chapters on exposing these people in the transnational banks in the last couple of years. And here we see a story in the top 10 for Censored 2014 that looks at how billionaires' rising wealth actually intensifies poverty and inequality.
All right, we're going to break, and when we return, we're going to continue our countdown of top underreported stories of 2013 with the director of Project Censored, Mickey Huff. Stay tuned.